Joining us.
Good morning, it's a pleasure.
Let's start by defining subordinate legislation.
Yeah, perhaps I should just correct one thing. The committee has long been established since 2008, and in 2011 we went through a process of amendments. So it is a committee that has been existing. We are quite correct to say that it is the first in Africa, and it competes fairly with first world countries such as Canada. What subordinate legislation is really, it is an instrument, it actually gives expression, it is law that gives expression to principal legislation. In our case, we would talk of regulations. In a municipality, it's bylaws. So it's no different from other pieces of legislation that are subordinate to principal legislation. So basically, in a nutshell, that's how I would describe subordinate legislation. It's not only regulations that are subordinate to your proclamations and your notices, but for the purpose of the CSSL, we take a keen interest and we have an obligation to scrutinize regulations, nothing more than that.
Tell us, having been the first in Africa, sounds like it's pretty important. What's the significance?
Well, the significance is related to the role of the executive and the role of the legislature. You see, the legislature delegates lawmaking to the executive. And once legislation is passed by the legislature, the executive normally, in most instances, is then given latitude and scope to pass regulations without scrutiny. So the importance of our committee is that after the executive has passed regulations, not principal legislation, we then also have an opportunity of scrutinizing the very subordinate legislation they would have passed, because it has a direct impact on the people of Gauteng. An example would be, you'd have a bill, right, which will be promulgated into an act, and then regulations which have a direct impact on the people, in that it regulates certain areas of operation. So our intervention allows us to scrutinize subordinate legislation and not to leave it to the executive. So what we do is we support the executive in ensuring that legislation is fair and just, even at the level of subordinate legislation.
And when you're scrutinizing the particular legislation, do you get input at all from members of the public? What's their role when it comes to this?
What we actually allow ourselves to do is we give ourselves an opportunity to go through the public participation process report, which the committee would have undertaken. We also invite public comments, but through the executive, because as you know, we know with the passage of laws, there is a process wherein legislation is advertised in newspapers, and people are then able to comment either for or against. So we take such inputs into consideration. But over and above that, I think it's important to stress that we are more of a technical committee. We look at the legalities, but we also take into consideration the socioeconomic impact of legislation. However, that alone does not invalidate law, whether negative or positive. It does not necessarily invalidate law. What invalidates it is when subordinate legislation is found to be in total contradiction to the Constitution. It's found to be vague and ambiguous. It's also found to be conferring unreasonable powers to the executive. So basically it is only on those grounds that we can disallow it.
And then if someone is at home and they have particular issue with a particular piece of legislation for whatever reason, how do they then get in touch with the committee and say, this is what my problem is, could you look into this?
They're at liberty to do so. As you know, that the legislature, one of our key mandates is public participation. And the public is at all times given an opportunity to express themselves either through written submissions or oral submissions. But it does not necessarily mean that if there is an objection from one particular person, then that warrants a total revamp of legislation. However, it does guide the legislature in taking a decision that, serves the broader public. But it does not mean that if Ms. X has a particular problem with the implementation of just one piece of legislation, then that calls for a total revamp or introduction of new legislation. But we do want the public to participate. We are there for the public, and public participation is a major mandate and component of what we do.
There we go. Thank you so much. Gauteng leading the way again. Let's hope it will be the first of many. Thank you so much for joining us. And that's where we leave it right now. We're speaking to Refilwe Letwaba about subordinate legislation and a committee that's specifically tasked to scrutinize such. Right now,